So I'm really excited to now be announcing our next speakers here at the Youth-A-Thon. So next up we have Mackenzie Guy, Samantha-Lynn Martinez and Aviv Pinker from the Seattle Aquarium, and they are doing a really exciting session, and actually this is pre-recorded because they are going to be having some quite exciting things in terms of microscopy and our oceans. So they've introduced themselves in their video, so I'm just going to share my screen so that you can all see that, and they will take it away in their video.
Hi, my name's Aviv. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm really excited to be learning about plankton with you today.
Hi everyone, my name is Samantha-Lynn and I use she, her pronouns, and like Aviv, I'm super excited to be teaching you all about plankton today and discovering some new things with you.
Hello, my name is Mackenzie and I use she, her pronouns. We are a group of youth ocean advocates from the Seattle Aquarium, and we are super excited to tell you all about plankton and microplastics today. The Seattle Aquarium's mission is to inspire conservation of our marine environment. And today, we hope to inspire conservation within all of you, specifically on how we can protect our oceans to create a better future for everyone. Today, we're going to learn all about plankton and what plankton does to help protect us as humans and the entire marine environment. So let's head over and learn about plankton from Aviv.
Hey everyone, it's Samantha again. So as we're on the way over to the exhibits to meet up with Aviv, I want to give you all a really quick rundown of what you can expect from the Seattle Aquarium team today during our session. First off, we're going to go over the plankton basics, so everything you need to know about plankton to begin with. Aviv and I will walk you through the aquarium, we'll meet some really exciting critters and talk about the different types of plankton, why plankton are so important, and what they mean in the grand scheme of the Puget Sound ecosystems and beyond. And of course, it's just a great excuse to show you around the aquarium and show you some of our favorite critters. Next up, we're going to dive into the sound, metaphorically, by doing a plankton tow together. Mackenzie and Aviv will guide you through the entire process of collecting water samples right off of the back of the Seattle Aquarium Pier. You're going to familiarize yourself with the real tools that real scientists and researchers use out in the field to collect water samples, and we'll take a closer look later on in our quote-unquote labs, aka our classrooms here at the aquarium, and show you what we find. You're going to be able to watch us prepare our water samples, prepare slides, prepare our microscope, operate the microscope, and identify all of the plankton critters that we find in our plankton tow sample for today. We'll also guide you through the identification of a ton of different types of plankton, and don't worry, it can sound quite overwhelming because there's so many different kinds, but we'll do some discovering alongside you guys today, so it'll be a lot of fun. And we might just test out your plankton identification skills as well. There might be some kind of pop quiz in the middle of this, but I promise it'll be so much fun, you'll do great. After that, Mackenzie will go over a ton of important details about plankton and climate and plastic. She's going to discuss the role that plankton play in climate and climate change, and also the roles that plastic play in the lives of plankton and ultimately the lives of all other organisms associated with plankton in the end. Following Mackenzie, I'll get the chance to sit down with former youth ocean advocate Dr. Anya Brandon, who is an incredible individual all around who's been working in research and policy in regards to plastic. She'll be able to give us a ton of advice on what we can do on a personal, community, city, or statewide level to combat the plastic pollution problem. We're going to go into detail about some of her research, some exciting things she's found out over the years, and also some exciting next steps that are possible solutions to our problems. All in all, it's going to be an excellent time, and we promise she's going to be an excellent resource for anyone out there who's interested in getting into this career area later on in their lives. And finally, to wrap up our session, we would love to have a live Q&A with all of you who are watching right now. So if you have any questions or comments that come up during this entire session, keep those ready and make sure to put them down into the chat when we get to the last bit of our session. And of course, keep your eye out for any of these random field trips that we may be taking throughout the entirety of the session, like the field trip you're taking in my backyard here in Seattle, for example, because we really want to emphasize that plastics and plankton and everything about the ocean is all interconnected. So we're going to take you on some fun field trips that are super unexpected, but super fun. So we hope you enjoy. The rest of the Seattle Aquarium team and I are so excited to be here with you celebrating World Oceans Day. So with that said, let's meet up with Aviv on our Life on the Edge exhibit and get started with learning about plankton and meet some awesome critters.
All right, so today we're learning about plankton, but what actually makes a plankton plankton? So the defining characteristic of plankton is that it's an organism that cannot propel itself against the current. So it's drifting with the current. It can't really do much to control its direction or its speed, or a lot of animals and plants, organisms that are planktonic, can move a little bit, but they can't move enough to really control their direction against the current.
So before we meet a ton of the critters at the aquarium, I'm coming to you from Tugboat Beach in the North Puget Sound, and I want to go over two of the main types of plankton you can expect to learn about today. The first type is phytoplankton, and we call those plant-like plankton. They aren't exactly plants or classified as plants, but they do have chlorophyll and can photosynthesize, and we'll go into more detail about that later. The next type of plankton we're going to talk about is zooplankton, and these are animal-like plankton. These are really awesome critters that can sometimes turn into something completely unexpected, and you'll meet a few of those critters today when we go through the aquarium with Aviv. And yeah, they're really awesome, and you'll get to see what they turn into one day and what we classify as zooplankton and what that means for the ecosystems of the Puget Sound and beyond.
So here we have some organisms that had a stage in which they were planktonic when they were larvae and they were floating with the current, and then they grew up, settled down, and attached themselves to something. Now they're not planktonic because they're not drifting freely with the current. And so there's a term for that, which is neuroplankton. So that means an organism which has part of its life cycle as plankton and part of its life cycle as not plankton. So for example, these sea stars here, which are very beautiful, and also we've got some green sea urchins over here, some plumose anemones, we've got some bivalves, I think some scallops. These are all organisms which started out as plankton when they were really young, so they're called neuroplankton. And if we take a trip over here, we've got some other organisms, and we like to call this exhibit here our jelly donut because we have some beautiful jellyfish in here. And these are moon jellies, which are the most common species of jelly in our local waters. And they are really beautiful, as you can see. And you can see them kind of pulsating. And they've got these tentacles that they use to sting and grab food, like small fish. You can see they're all sort of moving in the same direction. And you might be thinking, why is that? Can't they swim wherever they want to? Well, these are actually plankton. So when you think of plankton, you might think of really teeny tiny microscopic organisms, which is true for a lot of plankton, but there are also plenty of organisms like these and organisms that are even way bigger that we can talk about later that are also planktonic. So they've got movement, but not quite enough to move themselves against the current. So they're all drifting with the current. They're all planktonic, and we have a term for organisms that spend their whole life cycles as plankton, and that's holoplankton. As opposed to neuroplankton. So these jellies right here are holoplankton. They spend their entire lives as plankton, unable to control their movement against the current. All right, so here we've got a nice up-close look at some of our neuroplankton, which are organisms that started out as plankton and now they are not plankton. So we've got some red, purple, and green sea urchins spread throughout our exhibit here. And those are an example of organisms that, when they were larvae, drifted with the current freely until they developed enough to attach themselves to a surface once they were fully developed. And now they're able to move along rocks and kelp and other surfaces. So they're no longer plankton because they're no longer drifting with that current. And one fun thing we like to do with our urchins is get urchin hugs. If you stick your finger gently between their spines, don't worry, these ones are not venomous. They'll give you a little hug because they think, you know, maybe you're some food or something that's come their way. But don't worry, it doesn't hurt. I'll just do a little demo here. And so you can see its spines closing around my finger, give me a little hug. They're not too sharp. And it's also, if you look closely, got some really cool tube feet that are probably reaching out to sort of check out my finger, see what it is, see if it's some kelp, some food or something. So those are really cool tools that they have. So now I'm gonna end that little urchin hug. And also in this exhibit, we have lots and lots of beautiful sea anemones. And these are also organisms that started out as larvae, and they were drifting through the water as plankton, and then they settled down, and they're what's called sessile. They're attached to one spot for the most part. There is a swimming anemone that looks really funny when it swims, and in emergencies they might be able to detach, but really they're kind of settled down for life in one spot. So that is pretty much the opposite of plankton. They're nice and settled down, and these organisms have stinging cells, and so if you touch them, they'll actually sting your finger. But human skin is pretty thick for the stinging cells that they have, so it doesn't sting. It just sort of feels like they're sticking onto you. So I can demonstrate that here. So you can see its tentacles really grabbing onto me, grabbing my finger, maybe even trying to bring it towards the center, its mouth. But I'm not going to let this anemone eat me today. I'm going to gently remove my finger. And that's a fun little thing we like to do with some of our Neuroplankton organisms here at the aquarium. So I'm sitting here next to Licorice, who is our beautiful giant Pacific octopus here at the aquarium right now. And you might be wondering, well, Licorice doesn't really look like she's plankton at all. She's pretty stuck on there, as you can see, with these amazing, amazing arms of hers. But believe it or not, when octopuses hatch from their tiny little eggs, there can be thousands of eggs in one bunch. When they hatch out of their eggs, they're planktonic. They're not yet big, developed, strong enough to swim around where they want to go or walk around where they want to go. So they drift with the current, and they slowly grow over a few weeks. They spend a few weeks in their planktonic stage until they get large enough to swim where they want to go and walk where they want to go, attach themselves to different surfaces. Licorice here is now pretty big, pretty far removed from her planktonic stage, and giant Pacific octopuses can live for about 5 years, which is a surprisingly short lifespan, and they're actually the biggest species of octopus in the world. So Licorice is really cool. We're really glad to have her here to help us out with our plankton education, and yeah, thank you, Licorice. All right, so here we have some smaller tanks with some hermit crabs in there. There's a few back here, and we also have a really, 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 really cool molt of a Puget Sound king crab. It's got this really cool structure. And the reason why we're over here with the crabs is because crabs are another organism that are considered neuroplankton. They start out as planktonic larvae, and they float around for a little while with the current, grow bigger, and then the ones that are lucky enough not to get eaten by something else settle down and start their lives as adult crabs. And that brings us to a really important point about plankton. Plankton are the base of the food chain in the ocean. If an organism isn't plankton and it doesn't eat plankton, then it definitely eats something that eats plankton, or eats something that eats something that eats plankton. So plankton are everywhere. They're consumed by many, many different species, and plankton definitely consume each other. So plankton are really the base of the marine food pyramid. So now we are in our Pacific Coral Reef exhibit, our tropical exhibit, and this right here is a really, really, really cool giant clam. As you can see, it sort of has this opening right here where water can pass through the clam, and this clam, believe it or not, it's really big, but it doesn't eat like fish or reef fish or anything. It filter feeds on plankton that it filters through its body, and then it has body parts that are able to filter out what it wants to eat, and then it digests that. So it's just one of many organisms that filter feed on plankton. And another one is coral. So many corals filter plankton out of the water, mostly at night. So the polyps come out and they grab plankton and digest it and eat it. And one interesting fact about coral is that if it's suffering from a bleaching event, they can sometimes stress eat, and they'll eat a lot more plankton. So that's an interesting fact, but also reminds us why we need to protect our oceans. All right, so we are here in our Pacific Coral Reef exhibit, and we have an adorable little day octopus taking a rest right here on this coral structure. And much like the giant Pacific octopus, you might notice that this little day octopus is a bit smaller than licorice back over there, but they are very similar in that they both start out as tiny, tiny, tiny octopuses floating through the water. So they're plankton, Neuroplankton, and then they settle down if they're one of the lucky few that does not get eaten in their planktonic stage by another organism. And if they survive, then they settle down, grow to adulthood, just like our day octopus here. And that is really common in the world of plankton, especially Neuroplankton. That's why a lot of organisms have so many eggs, because the survival rate can be a little bit low when you're plankton floating around in the water and you have no way to sort of hide yourself, swim away, escape from predators that can just come by and eat you up, or you can be filtered out of the water by a filter feeder. So that's how the life of a plankton works. And it works for some of them in the end, like this day octopus.
All right, so I bring you into an intermission here back at Tugboat Beach, and I wanted to quickly talk about the importance of phytoplankton in the grand scheme of the ocean. First off, one fascinating fact about phytoplankton is that they're responsible for more than half of the oxygen we breathe. So half of the oxygen in the atmosphere is all thanks to phytoplankton. Next thing I want to address is the smell of the ocean. So right here, I'm on the beach, and if you take a nice deep breath, there's a really distinct smell of the ocean that no one can really put a pin on. It's almost like a veggie smell. I would probably describe it as that. It smells like broccoli sometimes, but really that smell is distinctly from phytoplankton as well, from something called DMSP, which stands for a very, very long chemical compound, which we'll try to pronounce right now. We'll break it up. Dimethylsulfonopropionate. Big word. It's going to be your best party trick if you learn how to say it, but that is all thanks to phytoplankton as well. So another cool fact for you, and now back to the aquarium. So we are here at our harbor seal exhibit, and you're probably wondering, why are we here at the harbor seal exhibit? Yes, it's cool to say hi to marine mammals, but they also show a really important idea that, again, plankton are the basis of the food chain. These guys absolutely love eating fish and also octopuses as well. And as we've previously discussed, a lot of these organisms eat plankton. From the very basis of that food chain, we are eating plankton, and without plankton, these guys wouldn't have any food. So it's super important to understand that literally everything is connected to plankton, especially our marine mammals and our lovely harbor seals, or I like to call them our little sea doggos.
All right, welcome to our awesome underwater dome exhibit, which is designed to be a representation of what you might see if you dove in Puget Sound right outside our aquarium. As we've been talking about, plankton are sort of the foundation of the marine food web. All over the world, the ocean, everything relies on plankton. There's phytoplankton. They're found in different concentrations in different places. Their concentrations can change depending on the season, the weather, the conditions, all sorts of things like that. But they're always there. They are really important because they're what's called primary producers. So they don't eat any prey for energy. They, like almost all other plants, create their own food, their own energy from the sun's energy through photosynthesis. And so they are plants just like on land, just like trees, just like bushes, just like flowers, except they are in the ocean. And they have the same chemical process of photosynthesis, which creates glucose for them to digest as energy, as chemical energy. And they also, like plants on land, like trees, give off oxygen in that process. And that's really important because they produce a lot of oxygen for our atmosphere. Also, phytoplankton are really important as primary producers because lots and lots and lots of marine organisms prey on them. So, most importantly, microscopic zooplankton, which are the tiny animals, can eat those phytoplankton, which do tend to be a little bit smaller. And then, in turn, those zooplankton can be eaten by a larger zooplankton, or filter-feeding animals like clams, or even some species of salmon. For example, sockeye salmon filter feed on plankton, especially like krill and also some small shrimp. And so if we take a look around in this exhibit, every organism relies on plankton in some way or another. It may be that that organism is plankton, or that that organism consumes plankton, or that that organism consumes prey that consumes plankton. But in some way, it's connected to plankton. So for example, we've got lots of silvery salmon swimming around. I believe we've got some coho salmon, as well as some steelhead trout in here. And those are fish that like to prey on smaller bait fish like herring, and they'll also eat small squid. And herring are fish that, if they're big enough, can feed on small fish, but they can also feed on zooplankton. And so that's an example of how salmon rely on plankton. And then in turn, predators of salmon, such as lingcod, which we have around here, there's one lying down there on the bottom, as well as orcas, which are a really famous marine mammal. And ooh, there's a nice big one right in that crevice over there. So all those animals that eat salmon, then it's clear how they rely on plankton too, because that plankton is moving up through the food chain to all these different organisms. And that also applies to these rockfish, which can also prey on herring and small squid. There are many, many organisms in here that are that rely on plankton in some way, either as prey directly or indirectly through the food web.
We've learned a lot about plankton today, so let's show you how scientists use plankton nets to catch plankton samples and analyze them. This is the net itself. We have a net ring and a rope to attach it to a railing so you don't lose it. This is the cod end. You attach it to the plankton net using these clamps, and you want to make sure you clamp it really tightly. Otherwise, it might fall off and you won't get your sample and also lose a pretty expensive piece of equipment. Next, you're going to take your rope and tie it to the railing. If you're not doing it over a pier, you want to make sure you hold onto it really tightly if you can tie it off. Coarse nets like these are perfect for catching zooplankton. Once you make sure your net is firmly tied onto your railing, or you're holding onto it very securely, you drop it over. Today we're going to be doing a vertical tip. You want to make sure an air bubble doesn't form at the top, otherwise you won't be able to get anything. Once your net reaches depth, you want to pull it up. Instead of lowering it down, you could also throw it. Once you have your net up, you want to unclamp the cod end. And be careful, there will be water spilling. Unscrew it, and then take your sample and pour it into a container, making sure to get as much water in as possible. It may not look like much, but once we get this under the microscope, there's going to be a lot of fun things for us to look at. We have two samples. This one is from the coarse net, and this one is from the fine net. Now let's head over to the microscope and see what we can find in these samples. So right now we are preparing a slide from the fine net, and we are going to put it under the microscope to see what we can find. In our fine net samples, and it is surrounded with some changed diatoms. We do not know what type of snail larva yet, but we're really happy we found it. The magic of plankton is that you never know what you're going to find when you look at a sample. We've done some research, and we think these are Noctiluca. These are one of the many organisms that can cause bioluminescence underwater. As you can see, it's moving around with its tail right now.
All right, so here we have some more Noctiluca, except these are Noctiluca during their snack time. This one up here has just munched on a diatom, so it's engulfed it. And they're really interesting because they're classified as phytoplankton, but they exhibit some behaviors that align more with animals, like eating other organisms.
So here we have a jelly and two ctenophores. The ctenophores are in a full spherical shape, while the jelly is behind them. You can see them kind of pulsating right now. Ctenophores are actually the largest animals to use with the help of cilia, which you can see pulsating right now. Cilia are kind of like tentacles that help them with propulsion through the water.
We have a crab larva, and just like we said before, plankton is mysterious. You never know exactly what you're going to find, and we don't know exactly what type of crab this is, but as you can see, it is segmented, and they're moving around a lot too, which is really cool to see under a microscope. Someday this guy will grow up to be a big crab like this. This is a siphonophore, and they reproduce asexually through a budding process, where one will kind of bud off from the other one, creating two siphonophores.
Thank you so much, Aviv and Mackenzie, for that awesome demonstration and closer look at the water sample we collected today. With that said, it's now time for Neuroplankton identification trivia with Samantha. I'll show you a series of photos, and for each photo, I'll give you a few seconds to take a guess as to what kind of animal this plankton will become. As a reminder, Neuroplankton are organisms that only spend a portion of their life as plankton and develop into something else when they hit their adult stage. With that said, let's get started with our very first photo. So, who's this? Drum roll for the first photo, please. It is a sea urchin. Although they might not have spines right now, those tube feet are a huge hint as to what kind of organism it is. Sea urchins are part of the echinoderm family, which all have tube feet. So knowing that you can see those tube feet during its planktonic stage is a huge hint that it's maybe an echinoderm of some kind. Next up is this photo. Who do you think this will turn into one day? Something about this photo seems familiar. And it's a sea cucumber. You may notice its slightly elongated shape, but one huge hint again are those tube feet. Sea cucumbers, like the sea urchins that we just saw recently, have tube feet because they're part of the echinoderm family. It's really cool to see that these echinoderms start off as teeny tiny plankton at the very beginning of their lives. All right, next up is this photo. What do you think this is? And it's a barnacle. I know it doesn't seem like it at all, but barnacles are crustaceans. You may have seen barnacles on the sides of boats, on the side of pilings and piers, but these guys are actually free-floating plankton before they settle down and form a shell of their own. Finally, we have this photo. What do you think this will turn into? Drum roll for the final photo of the day. This right here is going to be a sea snail when it's older. This sea snail larva is what we call a veliger. It has a ciliated velum, which are these things right here, and a lot of these veligers sometimes already have a foot or will develop a foot later on that helps them attach to surfaces when they're adults. They're probably one of the most recognizable zooplankton that we get in a ton of our toes here right off the pier at the Seattle Aquarium. With that said, great job everyone. This was definitely a tough one, but I bet you all did great. Now you can quiz your family and friends on their plankton identification, and with that said, let's catch up with Mackenzie, who's currently in the San Juans, to discuss the importance of plankton for our climate and the impact of plastics on our marine environment in general.
When people think of the ocean, they often think about what they can see. The endless blue waves, whales, fish, some invertebrates, but there is so much more to our oceans than what meets our eyes. Plankton are some of the most important members of the marine life ecosystem, and we can't even see them. Without plankton running things behind the scenes, both human and animal lives would be in danger. Phytoplankton produces oxygen through photosynthesis. They take in sunlight and CO2 and produce oxygen. They literally take in the bad and expel the good. They produce between 50% and 85% of the world's oxygen. It is difficult to know exactly because phytoplankton populations change depending on the season. Through photosynthesis, phytoplankton consume carbon dioxide on a scale equivalent to forests and other land plants. Some of this carbon is carried to the deep ocean when phytoplankton die, and some is transferred to different layers of the ocean as phytoplankton are eaten by other creatures, which themselves reproduce, generate waste, and eventually die. Worldwide, this biological carbon pump transfers about 10 gigatons of carbon from the atmosphere to the deep ocean each year. Even small changes in the growth of phytoplankton may affect atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, which would feed back to global surface temperatures. The planet's ecological health depends on regular plankton blooms, such as the spring event in the North Atlantic, in which huge numbers of phytoplankton accumulate over thousands of square miles. Plastic has become a part of our daily lives. From yogurt containers to plastic bags to hold snacks to pouches popsicles come in, plastic has infiltrated our lives. Microplastics are officially defined as plastics less than 5 millimeters in diameter, about 0.2 inches. For a visual, this is about the size of a pearl commonly used in jewelry. There are two categories of microplastics, primary and secondary. Primary microplastics are tiny particles designed for commercial use, such as synthetic exfoliants in cosmetics, as well as microfibers shed from clothing, other textiles, and fishing nets. Secondary microplastics are particles that are the result of breakdown from larger pieces of plastic, such as plastic water bottles. The breakdown is caused from environmental factors such as sunlight radiation and the ocean waves. Both types are extremely dangerous to our ocean's health. In 2014, it was estimated that there are between 15 and 51 trillion individual pieces of microplastics in the world's oceans, which was estimated to weigh between 93,000 and 236,000 metric tons. As humans, we have yet to see plastics break down completely.
They just keep getting smaller and smaller until we cannot see them. And that is the problem. Once we can't see something, we often don't think it's there, as we've learned with plankton. When you walk along the beach, you see some plastic and you pick it up. But that's really hard to do with microplastics because they're so small and oftentimes microscopic. It is really important to dispose of things properly so that they do not become microplastics and cause even larger issues in our oceans. Microplastics have been found in animals from plankton to whales and are completely damaging the ocean food chain. But what can we do? How do we stop the epidemic of plastic particles in our oceans? Reducing plastic consumption is extremely important. Opting for reusable plastic alternatives, such as packaging and products that are reusable, like water bottles, reusable straws, non-reusable cutlery that's not plastic. Anything to reduce plastic consumption is extremely important. Advocating for more plastic bans and climate bills that protect everything around us, our forests, our oceans, our air, is very important to stopping climate change. Education is by far the most important tactic. We have the chance to reduce more plastic in our oceans, but we have to educate people on its importance. The importance of recycling, the importance on using reusable products, and the importance of keeping our oceans clean.
These are microbeads. Microbeads are commonly found in personal care products like shampoos, soaps, and other hygiene items. Microbeads are microplastics that make their way into our oceans in various ways, for example, through drains. Microplastics are extremely harmful to our marine environment as they look very similar to plankton, and fish eat plankton, as we've learned today, as well as other various marine organisms. And when organisms eat plastic, it can severely damage their internal systems and sometimes lead to death. Humans also eat a lot of seafood. And if the seafood has eaten plankton or an organism that has plankton in it, they most likely are eating microplastics as well. It is now estimated that humans eat a credit card's weight worth of plastic each week. Microplastics are the cause of this.
So hi everyone, we have now reached our really exciting interview portion with our friend here, Dr. Anya Brandon, who is a former youth ocean advocate from the Seattle Aquarium. So it's really exciting we get a chance to sit down with someone who was quite literally in our shoes today. And it's really great because she's been up to some pretty incredible things in the professional field. So with that said, I will let Dr. Anya take it away with her introduction.
Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Anya Brandon and I am the AGU AAAS Congressional Science Fellow, currently working in the US Senate. I joined this position after finishing my PhD in environmental engineering and science at Stanford, where I also did my undergrad. And I was a youth ocean advocate at the Seattle Aquarium in 2008 to 2012.
So great to hear about where you are now, and it's really exciting that you're working with the US Senate, which is pretty big leagues, I will say that. Now, first off, I'd love to know, how did you kind of settle into this field specifically?
Great question. Most of my journey really started back in Seattle, where I grew up, and quite literally started at the Seattle Aquarium. My fifth grade class took a field trip to the Seattle Aquarium, and we got to spend a lot of time learning about all the animals. And it was really the first time that I had kind of this light bulb go off, seeing things beneath the surface and how cool and different and just unique the ecosystems are and how they're right outside. And then you go outside the aquarium, you look down over the pier and you can't see anything. It's this like hidden gem, hidden mystery. I absolutely fell in love with the ocean and everything about it, and waited somewhat impatiently until I was finally old enough to come back and volunteer at the aquarium starting in my freshman year in high school. And just got more and more passionate about it, loved everything I was learning, loved getting to teach and educate other people about it. And you can't really learn about the ocean, especially in a place like Puget Sound, without learning about all the problems facing the ocean. Puget Sound is this great little microcosm of all of the difficulties that are facing our oceans writ large, whether it's ocean acidification from climate change to plastic pollution. And the one that really stuck with me was this issue of plastics. I just remember every morning I would park my car and walk down to the aquarium, and you walk along the pier and there's always a bottle, a bag, a something as you're walking along the pier. And I would always pop my head over hoping to see a jellyfish or a sea star, and instead you see all of this plastic. And it just really stuck with me. And so I decided, I wanted to do something about that. Took that with me to undergrad, decided to focus more on engineering. Could I help solve this problem with technology? What could we do to address this? And so for my grad school, I was looking at ways we could break down plastic waste to actually get rid of some of this plastic. So I studied plastic degrading bacteria that were found inside the gut of this insect called mealworms. We learned that these insects, because of all the bacteria in their gut, could actually eat and break down different types of plastics, like a styrofoam cup or polyethylene bag. And that's really exciting because it helps get rid of some of this plastic waste that we have. But the more I learned about it, the more as this technology seemed further and further away, because the economics weren't right, industry wasn't supportive of it, any number of reasons. Kind of the world writ large was like pushing us towards using plastics and single-use products. So I decided to, after grad school, take a step back and see if I could go big picture, figure out, what are the regulations, what are these general forces around us that are pushing us to these single-use items, and how can we break up that cycle? So that took me to the world of science policy.
That's sweet, especially that discovery that like science policy, it really opens people's eyes as to what's really fueling a lot of the systems that we have to somewhat subscribe to on a day-to-day basis, especially with plastic usage. And I think that's something that a lot of people out there, especially anyone who's watching this interview right now, I know Seattle youth were quite active when it comes to, climate and also just climate justice and whatnot, and really how we can dismantle a lot of systems that make us subscribe to a certain use of something that may be degrading the world rather than making it better. So I think it's a lovely story that you mentioned, just like that pathway of discovery. Mackenzie went over a lot of the ideas behind plastics and kind of what you can see versus what you can't see. And I'd love to know a little bit more about your research, Dr. Anya. So is there anything that has been quite exciting about the research that you've been doing? Something that kind of gives you a spark of hope for possibly a solution to how we can combat plastics in general, or any big threats that you think are really facing our world today?
I think the first one is that really hit me, and it's hit me a lot actually in my current position rather than in my research, is just how interconnected all of these issues are. My very first research experience as an undergrad was studying copepods, so studying a type of plankton that are often an indicator for climate change. You can see, the deterioration of their shell from ocean acidification. And, I don't think it was until, much later, in my current position, and, within the last few years, I really made the connection that plastics are directly fueling climate change. Plastics are just another product of fossil fuels. And the more dependent we are on plastics, the more dependent we are on fossil fuels. So, whether we're talking about plastic pollution in our ocean or ocean acidification, it's really the same, two sides of the same coin of this, kind of existential threat we have of using up this, remarkably unsustainable resource. So that's one thing that's really stuck with me. Another piece that stuck with me more in your line of what you can see and what you can't see, just like we have these plankton that are all around in our ocean, hardly visible to the eye, if at all, sometimes under a microscope. We're surrounded by bacteria, good bacteria, bad bacteria, a lot. Right now, we all probably think about viruses in this pandemic. There's a whole microscopic world around us that's directly influencing how we interact with the world. And these bacteria they existed here before us and have a lot, they've evolved over this incredible lifetime to work in combination with the rest of our ecosystem. So just like we need the bacteria in our gut to, eat and digest, other ecosystems need their bacteria too. And what's so interesting to me is that through our human actions of extracting fossil fuel and making these plastics, these petrochemical plastics, we've kind of thrust this new thing out at the world, something that these bacteria who have been here and evolving for so long have never seen before. And it's now starting to catch up. So I think one thing that's really exciting is that we're starting to see biology naturally evolve, or, through research and engineering, kind of like synthetic biology or bioengineering, catch up so that we can use some of these natural ecosystems to help us combat this very human problem. So in my research, we found that there are these bacteria that were totally naturally present that could, under the right circumstances, degrade plastic. And it's because these bacteria are involved to eat other plastic-like things. So think of waxes that are naturally found, in trees, saps, things like that. And these bacteria, because they can handle one thing, sometimes fortuitously can handle this other, huge glaring problem we have. And so I think it's kind of been a general reminder to me, both appreciate all that's going on in the world that we can't see with our eyes, but also just how much we need to work in conjunction with the natural ecosystem rather than against it.
What do you think are some really basic, simple steps that the youth out there can do either to combat this problem from their own homes or the way that they use things on a day-to-day basis? What are some really basic steps that the youth out there can take?
Yeah, I think in addition to all of these cool solutions and technologies that are coming down the pike, hopefully, to help us address plastics, the number one best solution is simply reduction. So using less plastic. It's reduce, reuse, recycle at the very end. So we really have been focusing on recycling, which is a great end of life for some plastics, but we really need to be refocusing on reducing in the first place. And now there's all sorts of actions that we can individually take in our household. With what we buy, we're using our, the power of the purse to tell companies what we value and what we want to see. So when we buy biodegradable products or reusable products, even better, we're telling them, this is where our values line up. This is what we want to see you making. That being said, it's not all on the individual. It's not your fault that there are certain plastics we just can't get away from right now. And I think that's really where it's on companies and ultimately on policymakers to help those companies along to make better products that are recyclable, products that are reusable, products that don't have 2 to 5 layers of packaging. We're never going to get rid of all of the plastic that we have in the world, but we don't need to use it to excess like we currently do. We've gotten very hooked on all these single-use convenient products. And if we can use, through our voice and our advocacy, through our purchases, kind of influence companies and policymakers to say, hey, enough is enough. We actually want to see some systematic change here. I think we'll get there.
That is lovely. And yeah, making that real change, especially from your point of view on the policy side of things, it is really trying to take a look at that bigger system and seeing what fuels it and possibly what people can do on various scales, not just individual, but all the way up to, the city, maybe the state, maybe even the country. It's really exciting stuff like that gets things going. But yeah, Absolutely. With that said, I know a ton of people probably are really interested on how they can even get to this point where they can really dive into something they're really interested in, maybe do some research, or maybe even head in the direction that you're in right now and doing policy. Can you explain probably a couple of tips or suggestions you have for anyone out there who's watching who really wants to dive into this work one day? Maybe they're a high school student or middle school student possibly, or early career, undergrad. What do you think are some really big tips that you want to share with them?
I think pursuing a career in science and engineering is going to be helpful no matter what. I'm incredibly biased, but I think that fundamental skill set of thinking critically and looking at how you can address problems is broadly useful, whether you want to keep going in science or go into education or research or policy. So I think, for everyone who's out there and interested, take a breadth of classes, explore, see what finds, what sparks passion in you, and then follow that. And even if that's not science, make sure you do a little bit of science education, because our world is so incredibly complicated. It's really helpful in this point of time to be able to think critically about issues. And I think science helps teach us that. I think the other thing I would say is that there's more than one way to use a science degree. I absolutely love getting my PhD and doing research and all of that, and decided I want to, don't want to stay and necessarily be a professor. I want to do something else with it. And all of those skills that you are taught as a scientist, whether it's in high school, in college, in grad school, are so directly relevant to other careers. We don't even think about it, because we kind of, we're taught like, oh, you are a scientist, this is what you do. Reading scientific papers or exploring the field, that it just, tells you that you're good at, distilling information from a really broad set of information and distilling it down and then being able to report it back to someone. Whether you're teaching as a scientist or if you have to help undergrads or help, mentor high schoolers, that means that you can take all of your really advanced knowledge and translate it and give it to someone else in a way that they can then use and understand. And that's all I do currently in policy is, take something that's really big and complicated, distill it down and, repackage it in a way that others can understand. I think being able to work with numbers comfortably and code, that's always going to be valuable no matter where you go. But I think really being able to think about these big skills that we get as a scientist, they're just so translatable to other fields, and we need more scientists in policy. We need more scientists to go on and be high school and middle school teachers. We need more scientists pretty much everywhere. Definitely think we need more scientists in journalism, in reporting and everything. So I think getting that broad education in science and then choosing what you want to use that for, that would be my best tip.
Sweet. Yeah, I love that point about scientists almost having this toolbox, and those tools can be used on whatever project you may end up with. And I think it's a great idea to think about what that really means, what that translates to, and especially your point about, even education, being a high school or middle school teacher, that's going to impact someone's life in one way or another. You're probably going to have a student who's really interested in one topic, and you can kind of spark them on a journey where they can really discover what they're really into. So I love that point so much, Dr. Anya. But yeah, with that said, I do believe that wraps up our time with Dr. Anya here, but it was so lovely chatting with you, and I wish you the best of luck on the rest of your journey in policy and combating the whole problem of plastics in the world. But yes, it was lovely speaking with you, and we will see you all later. All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for following along with us today as we've learned all about plankton and microplastics. Bye.
Bye.
We hope you all enjoyed our video. It's pretty early here in Seattle, so we were able to pre-record all of that, which I think was really great because we got that awesome microscope video. So if anybody has any questions they want us to answer live, you can put those in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll tackle them for the next session.
Yeah, we hope you all had a lovely time watching our little video. Did a lot of fun stuff, plankton toes and whatnot. And we did get a couple questions about seahorses during the video. And I think if any of you saw the Q&A when we answered them, we have a few pygmy seahorse fans in case anyone was curious.
Amazing. That was so fantastic, Mackenzie, Aviv and Samantha. I think that it was so obvious how much work you had all put into the film, so thank you so much for sharing that. And I can see that I couldn't see it during the session, but I can see now that the chat was very appreciative of that also. So thank you so much for being part of the Youth-A-Thon, and it was really great to kind of see a bit behind the scenes as well at the aquarium, which was pretty cool, but also hear all of what you had to say.